Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I hope you had a great weekend out there. Today, I want to talk about some of the failures of this administration because they are widespread and numerous. President Biden has been in office for 26 or 27 months, and it shows. Rather than take accountability or reverse course, his administration continues to double down, and even more pathetic is that for every failure they have, they want to blame the previous administration. Just look at the pathetic transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg. I mean, this is the most incompetent administration you could possibly imagine, where he says that it's Trump's fault that the train derailed in Ohio, in East Palestine, Ohio. Now, how is it Trump's fault? I mean, he blames the deregulation, but the reality is that they've been in office for 26 or 27 months. Joe Biden could have changed the policies with a stroke of a pen at some point. Pete Buttigieg acknowledges that there are thousands of train derailments each and every year, so why haven't they done anything about it? More importantly, we passed a $1.3 or $1.4 trillion infrastructure bill? Some of that money allocated to the railways. So what's going on? What is going on? And that shows the level of incompetence. And it's not just with Buttigieg. You look at Mayorkas, you look at the vice president, you look at our border, you look at the international landscape. Rather than take accountability, they just choose to just blame everyone else. And it's not just that the policies are a failure. The policies are actually dangerous. They have real-world impacts on our lives and the entirety of the international community. It's concerning to say the least. We are living at a moment where the world is a powder keg, and one miscalculation could lead to an explosion. It's why I'm bringing in Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. He's been on plenty of times. I want to talk to him about some of the concerns I have on what I'm seeing out there in the international landscape. He's the president of London Center, has a brand new podcast, The Hard Truth with Tony Shaffer. I encourage everyone to check it out. Before I bring on Tony, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Go to the PAS Report website, PASreport.com, and share it with your family and friends. With that out of the way, I want to bring in Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer to the PAS Report. Lieutenant Colonel, always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. How are you today?
It's been very good, very busy. I was just talking a little bit as we were getting ready to go. We just did an interview with my friend Adam Baldwin, the good Baldwin, not the bad Baldwin. You know, Adam, Alec, there's a difference, you know, yin and yang. I don't know which is yin or yang, but anyway, Adam and I were just talking about some of the issues relating to the Second Amendment and trigger control. Just saying, you know, maybe people should have paid attention to that a bit more. So anyway, but it's coming out soon on The Hard Truth. So yeah, so.
Very good. And I have to ask, because you're like the perfect guest to have on. I mean, I feel like in the last two to 3 weeks, a lot's changed in the international community, particularly when it comes to the idea of Russia's war in Ukraine. And one of the things I want to ask you is some of the statements coming out of Ukraine, their interests are different than our interests. Every country has their own self-interest. And we have this push in the United States as if the Ukraine's interests and the United States' interests are exactly the same. Can you explain to the audience how interests may differ?
They're not. I mean, they're not. The interests do differ, and they're not the same. And here's where I go back to what I learned during the Cold War. We had the same challenge then, Nick. We wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. Clearly, that was a stated objective. Ronald Reagan actually said it. But the way Reagan did it and his team did it are immensely different than what we're doing now. And that's the point. Our interests were always American interests with specific goals and objectives assigned to the policy. You establish the policy and then you set up goals and objectives that are achievable to support that. None of that's happening here. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite, because it seems to me this White House, Blinken and Austin, have completely eviscerated the framework and gains created by the Reagan administration, even before the Reagan administration, regarding the framework for arms control, for essentially making sure that there is a world order that, you know, most people sign up to. While they say they're trying to preserve the quote unquote Western order, they're not. They're doing the exact opposite, which to me then means that they may be doing it purposely. But let's go back to Ukraine. Ukraine is traditionally within the Russian sphere of influence. During the Cold War, from 1970 to the fall of the Soviet Union, they were part of the Soviet Union. I've argued a number of times that they both being the Russians, Ukraine, are run by oligarchs, and there is the veneer of democracy. That is to say, they have elections, and Putin's elected again. Wow, who'd have thought? What a shocker that is. And I think the same thing kind of goes on in Ukraine. In this case, though, in 2014, there was a deviation because Victoria Nuland and the Obama administration decided to engage in something called the color revolution. And what they were trying to do, which set us off on the current path we're on right now, is that they wanted Ukraine to move from the sphere of influence of the Russians to the sphere of influence of the EU. That's where this is all coming down. And that's why you see such a vigorous enticement being provided by Biden and company to the Ukrainians to keep on fighting, even though you're not NATO. And so this is where there's the divergence, to your point. Our interests regarding maintaining, and I'm saying this as an analyst, not as a personal preference. If the stated objective of the United States is to maintain the current Western world order, the order of things, then that is different than the interest of Ukraine. If our stated objective is to, we've had this world order since the end of World War II. We like having NATO as a strong component of our global security strategy. That doesn't include Ukraine. Ukraine's not NATO. And the more you push the idea of supporting Ukraine against Russia, the more you're going to antagonize Russia because, simply put, Ukraine's interests are not in NATO's interests. They're just not. NATO's interests are somewhat more aligned with the United States, but NATO's interests are not U.S. interests. And this is where we have a complete muddlement. Is that a word? Muddlement? Can I say muddlement?
We're going to say muddlement because that's what it is. I mean, when we look at strategic objectives, the Biden administration has not laid out what is the end goal? What do we want to see out of this? Now, if I'm looking at strategic objectives, if I look at Ukraine, they want us to get us on the ground in Ukraine in the kinetic war with Russia. That's in their strategic interest because that will give them the chance to win.
Right.
If I look at our strategic interests, and this is Nick Giordano's strategic interest, we want to see a weakened Russia, which Russia is significantly weaker today than it was on February 24th, 2022, and a Ukraine government that basically we control, which, given the amount of money and the military equipment, we've achieved that. But nobody's talking about a diplomatic solution. One of the things that I find troubling is some of the rhetoric coming out of Ukraine. So a few weeks ago, you had the Ukrainian authorities talking about how sooner or later Russian cities are going to suffer attacks, that there's going to be escalation and war will go into Russia. Just yesterday, we have the Ukraine security chief talking about that the war will end when Ukrainian tanks are parked in Moscow's Red Square. What is that dangerous rhetoric? How does that change the dynamics of the war, right? It was defensive where Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, how does that change? That type of rhetoric change the dynamics of this conflict?
It's dangerous. So one of the things about, again, even Kennedy, I rewatched recently the movie 13 Days. And
that was a phenomenal book.
Phenomenal, a good movie. So anyway, during the movie, I'm not sure if McNamara actually said it or not, but there's a scene where the Navy does something he's displeased with, and he says, "Don't do that. There's a new language, and that language is essentially reflected in our actions," which is true. And that's how both sides understood the required actions within the Cold War. Very minute, very precise, very minimal. You did not come out and necessarily make big threats, and very quiet. And this administration is doing just the opposite. Biden one day calls for regime change, for Putin's removed, and then he's not. Oh, I didn't really mean that. Nick, that is the danger, the muddlement of messaging and being completely imprecise. I would argue we're now more akin to the conditions that led up to World War I in 1917, because there's so much cross-talk, there's so much misinterpretation, and I think that's what the real danger is that nobody really knows. And I said this the other day on Newsmax, and I think it was taken the wrong way by some folks. It's like, Biden's not behind Ukraine. It's like, oh, of course. Like, no. Just look at the way he uses his words. He's not in it. It's like he reads from a script. It's like, yes, we will defend, and I think he does it in such a way to not be compelling. So, and that's my point. If you want Ukraine to win, you got to get in there and convince people you want Ukraine to win. Sending them 31 Abrams, that's a joke.
A year from
now. It's like, I'm not saying we should do it. I'm just saying that what you're proposing is not going to have a positive effect on helping Ukraine win. It is essentially a strategic virtue signal that the Russians see right through. And that's what I'm saying. It's like, you're not really in it to win it. You're not really in it to resolve it. Then why are you in it? Well, it's a complete muddlement. And I think the danger is you leave room for the Russians to be more aggressive, because the Russians, look, Putin's a bad guy. Never take my comments as somehow being pro-Russian. I'm not. With that said, Putin, being a thug, understands very clearly the language of the Cold War and of being potentially held to account regarding military force or some other force, clandestine force. The idea that there will be consequences to what you do. We're not going to tell you how we're going to do it. And that's what we did during the Cold War, Nick. The whole issue of Vietnam, they were doing things to help the North Vietnamese. We know this. We were doing things to help the Afghanis against the Russians. We know this. This was a proxy war where people understood the rules. Right now, and by the way, those were used to actually incrementally push the other side in some direction, not come out and say, we're going to bury you, which Khrushchev tried. It didn't work out for him. And that's where the language started being more reasonable. And I think this is what we're lacking. We're lacking nuance. We're lacking an understanding by our side how to actually go back and start using the language of the Cold War to be effective in negotiating a resolution.
And refresh my memory, because I think during previous conflicts, we never released like line by line account of exactly the military aid that we were giving to another country. We never released dollar amounts publicly that we were giving to another country in order to fight another country. We kept all that secret because we didn't want to escalate the situation.
Or antagonize openly. Exactly. We antagonized, but it was clandestine.
And now what we see, I mean, I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone that looks at international relations, understands the levels of analysis, understands why nations and states behave the way they do. I look at the rhetoric, I see the escalation taking place. There comes a point where, as all these weapons are flowing in, as Russian soldiers are getting killed, as you have Ukrainian officials calling that war is going to be in Russia, sooner or later, Putin's going to be backed into a corner. Why are you allowing America to give all these weapons to kill Russian troops? And now they're talking about a Crimea offensive, which again, it's all because there's no real objective of the Biden administration that's been clearly laid out. And there's been a couple of reports that when it comes to the Crimea, the United States was going to take a hands-off approach. Just leave it be with Russia right now. Don't really get involved. But now Ukrainian officials are becoming very ambitious that they're going to look to try and take the Crimea.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Things?
It's not in the cards. So let's walk through that. So first off, I'm appalled that we, the United States, not you and I, but others who are in positions of authority and power and policy influence, don't understand the Russian mentality. The Russians are, by all accounts, paranoid because, they've been invaded several times. Napoleon, Hitler, they have a record of having nations come and invade them and do bad things to them. So you've got to acknowledge that as a fact of history, and that the Russians have internalized this as part of how they see the world.
But our so-called experts are too simple-minded. They can't look at anything from other perspectives, and if you do, then you're pro-Kremlin. That's how. I know. It's like they don't want to have a debate. Right. They just want to label you.
I'm not pro-Russian. I'm just saying you got to actually examine the world from their perspective. So when I hear Putin speak, he reflects their point of view. And oh, by the way, he's going to act on his point of view. He's not going to act on our point of view. We can say all day, they don't understand that NATO means of no risk. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because Putin is convinced otherwise. And this is where I want to grab Tony Blinken.
Would have helped if we changed the mission of NATO in 1995.
Right. And they did. They pledged it. And that was part of the Dayton Accords as part of some of the other things we did as part of the Ukraine issue. We did all this. So I'm just frustrated because we clearly have people who just don't understand or are willing to actually understand the system of how we got here. With that said, then, I've seen other folks, other voices out there. I love Doug McGregor, and I listen to him all the time. I listen to Judge Napolitano. I like their point of view. I don't think it's completely accurate because they say far too much about them. They believe that this is to liberate the Donbass. I believe this is all about resources. Basically, one of the things that happened in 2014, which I think led the Obama team to wanting to put the Ukrainians into the EU is oil and gas, a resource Europe badly needs. And so when you found all those reserves, Katie barred the door. Let's grab that for our friends in the EU. That's what it was all about in my judgments. It's all about the resources. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. And it was all about the fact that if the EU became the dominant force that protected Ukraine, that means that Ukraine becomes a net competitor for Russia and Russia's gas. So that's the way I see it. I'm seeing this in purely, is there nationalistic issues? Did Putin want to roll in and protect all the Russians? Yeah, maybe. But he's not motivated by that as much as I think the economic benefits of preventing Ukraine from being a net competitor in selling gas and oil. Just saying. That's my assessment. I'm sticking to it. Yeah. So that's why. Well, I'm just telling you, people tend to go to war over gas and oil more than, what flag it is. I'm just saying.
Well, it's power and economics. I mean, most wars come down to power and economics.
That's what I believe. What do I know? I've only got a political science degree, But with that said, it doesn't change the dynamic that Putin has used all this nationalistic language to justify his actions. I get it, but I don't think that's what the root core is. The root issue is resources and competition. And I think the moment that the Obama administration, either knowingly or unknowingly, started poking the bear directly. I mean, there's one thing to your point, Nick. NATO's kind of incrementally been moving up, and Putin's been saying, "Don't do it, don't do it." You did it. So there comes a point of brisance where it breaks, and that we passed that point. And now to win in Ukraine, and let me be painfully clear for you and your audience, and I know you and I would agree on this. I think you're not going to win against Russia unless you bring in NATO. The numbers don't add up. 31 Abrams, 18 Challengers, 30, maybe 28 Leopard 2s. That's not even a reinforced brigade up against 3 Soviet-style tank armies. One of the things, Nick, that the Russians have done, they tried the 5th generation warfare thing, the total war. It didn't work out. It's like, yeah, we can't figure it out. We're not going to do it. Yeah, we screwed up. And so they've gone back to what they know. Overwhelming, brute force, and nibbling away at the enemy, a war of attrition. That's what's going on. And again, how do they not see this in the Biden White House? And the only way, mark my words, I am not pro-Russian, but the only way that the Ukrainians are going to be able to win and stop what I see as the inevitable partition of Ukraine is by bringing NATO and NATO troops in, because the force numbers just don't add up any other way.
Yeah, 100%. And it's amazing to me. And I want to pick up on that point when we get back. We're going to take a short break. When we get back, I want to pick up on that point, and I want to pick up on the failures of Russia at the beginning of this, and then how you adapt to the changing landscape of the battlefield. So we'll be right back. As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get yours today. Obviously, Russia screwed up in the initial invasion. They thought it would be a 2-week campaign, and that's what they planned for. They didn't learn any of our lessons over the last 20-something years, but They thought it was going to be a 2-week campain. What people don't realize, first of all, even if Russia is weakened, they still have a much more superior military than the Ukrainians. And in the theater of
deep
war,
bench, very deep bench,
absolutely. And you learn from your mistakes, and you constantly readjust in war. And that's exactly what they're doing right now. One of the things that really concerns me is you now have Xi Jinping going to meet with Vladimir Putin. And a lot of people think that they're allies. It's an alliance of convenience, let's be honest.
It is.
China doesn't want Russia to be a power either. But one of the things, you see how it's expanding. I have little doubt. I mean, knowing how the communist regime operates, they're going to be looking to, we're giving everything to Ukraine. They're going to be looking to sell Russia the weapons for discounted oil prices in the process.
Right.
And you basically see, in my opinion, prior to the invasion, 2 weeks before the green light was given to the Russian troops, Vladimir Putin met with Xi Jinping. I could guarantee you Xi Jinping was antagonistic. Don't let the Americans dictate to you. Don't let them push you. You got to worry about your territory. Go in, take Ukraine. And then I could guarantee you in this meeting, Xi is going to be pushing Putin further. Do you think that it's at a realm of possibility, my theory that I'm coming up with, that Xi would love nothing more than to see the United States and Russia engage in a physical kinetic war, and then they come in and basically claim status to the dominant power in the world?
I think it's very possible.
Without firing a shot.
I think it's very possible because obviously we played the China card during the Cold War too, Nick. Remember that? Nixon?
I do.
Only Nixon could go to China. That was the saying, and it's true. It's like he opened that door, and that was a great lever point against the Russians. For a fact, what was that movie with the Wolverines in it, with Powers Booth and the kids shooting up the invasion? They talked about the Chinese coming in and killing Russians during, I can't remember the name of that movie, but it was, oh my God, I'm geezing here, but it was, I'll think about it after we're done. But my point being is that, we did the same thing. And China helped us win the Cold War by that lever point. So who's to say that, China won't we could do that back. And I think that's what they plan on doing. Biden and Blinken, I think this is Blinken mostly, somehow believes that holding China in a light that, we just have to be nice to them. That's why this whole China balloon thing has gone away. We don't want to talk about that. And I do believe that at least 3 of the 4 balloons were Chinese origin. One was shot down. It was just like a science project. But the other 2, by independent sources I look at, a Harvard guy who monitors the activities, he traced them back to northern China. So I'm saying at least 3 of the 4 were Chinese. But they don't want to talk about that, Nick, because, we don't want to antagonize Chinese because, we want the Chinese to not get in bed with Putin because, we don't want we don't want Putin to upset our global order. And it's kind of like China wants that order upset. I mean, I don't think you're going to encourage him to do anything except it's like you're saying, if you encourage Russia, you're going to upset global order. It's like, that's what they want. It's like, they want the global order to be disrupted. Anyway, and so, I think it's going to go very badly for the Biden administration because the Chinese are very patient. They're playing their cards very close to the chest. But I do believe that they're trying to antagonize and encourage Putin to be more aggressive. But at the same time, I think they could see they want to gain advantage no matter what. And I can tell you, Nick, if they saw that they could gain more advantage by offering a peace process, they do that. They do that because that gives them stature. Because part of what they're trying to do is break down our prestige as the United States and make us look weak, which they're doing a great job of. And the idea is, don't go with the United States, go with us. That's what the whole balloon thing was about. It wasn't about surveillance. It's like they can get that stuff off satellites. This was all about poking, see what they could get us to do or not do, and then saying, see, they're weak. They either don't respond or they over respond. They don't bother with them, bother with us. And ultimately, I think this is a war again about economics and power. This is about trying to destabilize further the U.S. petrodollar for purposes of allowing Putin to gain access and prestige. He's doing well economically, and the Chinese want to do what they can to upend our control of global markets as well by the currency issue. So I think ultimately that's what they're trying to do is destabilize us in the end. So
and it's idiotic logic. Let's be honest about that. It's the same foreign policy mistakes that we've seen over the last 30 years with China. Constantly when it came to North Korea, we would constantly go to China and say, hey, it's in the international community's interest not to see nukes in North Korea. Get on board with us. We want to preserve humanity and get these nukes out of a crazy dictatorship. Where China's looking at it, they're not attacking us with nukes if a war breaks out. So it's not a threat to us. We don't care about the global community. We care about China's interests. Now, the second President Trump said, hey, listen, if you don't help us with North Korea, we're going to hurt your economy. China changed its tune. So you have to appeal to what's in their national interest. And China is much more worried about 1.3 billion people and unemployment than they are about nuclear missiles in North Korea. Same thing holds true with Russia.
Right.
China doesn't want to see a massive all-out war because they still want us to buy their products. And in a World War III scenario, you ain't buying Chinese products. But the reality is they do want to see Russia and the United States go tit for tat for each other and begin to weaken each other. And if the United States comes in with a diplomatic solution, that strengthens our hand. Now, one of the things I find interesting that you don't hear anything about, you have President Macron of France and German Chancellor, I can't recall his name off the top of my head, both in the last couple of weeks have talked about the need for a diplomatic solution.
They have.
Why are they talking about a diplomatic solution and we're not? And why aren't they receiving any attention? I mean, this is in Europe's backyard. We're thousands of miles away from this. So you would think like we should be listening to certain European leaders, particularly ones like France and the economic motor of Europe and Germany.
Well, it's a simple answer, Nick. We don't know about this because the U.S. media refuses to cover the facts of what's going on the ground. And the fact is this: Europeans have no stomach for another war. They don't. Nobody wants it. The Germans don't support it. The French don't support it. And let's face it, to that point, if we're talking about nuclear weapons, nuclear arms, a tactical release of nuclear weapons is really going to ruin Poland's day, Germany's day, and France's day. Just say it. It's not going to be pleasant. And for those who in the audience who are as old as me, remember a movie called Threads? It was the British version of the nuclear holocaust. We had the day after, they had Threads. And you don't want to walk down that path. And I do believe the Europeans have a memory, somewhat faded, but still there, that they remember the standoff between us and the Russians during the Cold War. And they have no stomach for the idea of any sort of conflict that could spread into the western part of Europe. They don't want it. So they recognize, as many of us do, it's like, this is the first time in our history that I remember us not being that helpful friend to try to find a way to open and maintain a diplomatic set of contacts. Even during the Cold War, Nick, we had diplomatic contacts with the Soviets. We never let that go, no matter how bad it got. And that's something we're not doing. And I think that's why you have these European leaders saying it's time for this. And that's because, yeah.
And I have to ask, Cy Hirsch's report, I'm not sure if you've read it, but about Nordstrom.
I haven't. So look, I know Cy. My experience with Cy is very positive. Yes, he's been wrong at times, but I always kind of look back at who benefits from the action. And without reading a report, I don't want to, say something that's going to get me in trouble or you in trouble. I tend to believe that Cy is probably accurate on this based on the rumors I've heard. And I do believe that this could have been done by us without regard to the second and third order effect of consequences. I do. I don't necessarily think we did it. I think the British may have done it, but I do believe that we had a heavy hand in planning it. And I just don't think Putin would blow up his own economic resource. I just don't think he's like that. But I know Cy. I've not talked to him about this. I do plan on trying to reach out at some point and speak to him directly. I prefer to get people to talk to me face to face and find out what they really think. I'm going to try that at some point, but at this point, I have not done this.
Yeah, and listen, you go back in our history, you see the Maine in the Spanish-American War, you see the Gulf of Tonkin during Vietnam. So it's not something that's out of the question. But looking at a lot of the neocons and the Democrats who've turned into the biggest war hawks you could possibly imagine, it wouldn't shock me. I do believe the report is true, and I think it was an effort to actually get a European country to attack Russia, thereby drawing us into the conflict.
Well, I agree with your assessment on that. It's just, to me, you look back on some of those things you mentioned, even if you watch 13 Days, the movie, they talk about doing some sort of a provocation with Cuba. That's actually included in there. It's like do a provocation to get it to look like they started it. So it's not beyond our policy of doing that. I think it's stupid. I think the inevitable bad consequences are always something you don't think through, and I don't think they've thought through on this. So anyway, I do believe that the Biden administration is out of its league. I've said this multiple times. I think I've said it on your program before. You have the high school debate team in charge of national security, and it's showing every step of what they do. So,
and I have to ask, where do you think it's all heading? I mean, obviously that's speculation. You're trying to predict what's going to happen. But at this stage, given everything that's going on, given what political leaders here and around the world are saying, what can Americans expect over the next, 6 to 8 months? What do you think is going to happen?
I think that the war is going to be done by the summer, and I don't think it's going to come out in the favor of Ukraine. I think if the only way Ukraine's going to win is if NATO, to include troops, moves in directly to confront the Russians. The moment that happens, I think we're going to see a heavy and sustained escalation across the board. We're talking about World War III. I hope that doesn't happen. But that the Russians are not going to back down. There's no reason for them to back down. They do see that NATO is an existential threat. You got to accept that, whether you agree with it or not. That's
and in Russia, if you lose wars, you die. It's not here like Putin, General Milley and you get a promotion. You're going to die.
And I've said this. I said this on your show. I think if Putin loses, he's dead. They're going to get rid of him. It's what always happens with the Russian leader. If you lose, you're out. It's done.
And it's the inner circle that kills you. It's not like the opposition groups that kill you and take over. It's the inner circle, more hardliners that actually take over.
There's no going back for Putin. He wins or dies. That's it. And the Russians feel the same way because they feel he's made a compelling case. Yes, there's voices of dissent in Russia. Yes, there's folks who are having second thoughts about the war. It doesn't change the direction. It doesn't change the numbers of what Putin has available to him and is probably going to use to win the war. So just saying.
Yeah, it's crazy times. And that's why everyone needs to check out The Hard Truth with Tony Shaffer. Great podcast. Tony, always enjoy our conversation. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, look, I appreciate having the honest conversation about this so nobody can say we're Russians. We're not.
Yeah.
Just trying to be practical. So.
Well, these are the debates that should be happening. I mean, to me, it's shocking that you have people in the media just talking so casually about this as if it's not that big of a deal. And nobody's asking, well, President Biden, like, what's the end goal that you want to see? What's our foreign policy? What's our strategic interest? And it hasn't been defined at all. So you would think there would be responsible people out there that are asking these questions, having these conversations without stupid name calling, but unfortunately not. We're in 2023. It's bizarre times.
Oh, I appreciate you not calling me names, Nick. Thank you for having me on.
I always enjoy my conversations with Tony. Everyone needs to check out his new podcast, The Hard Truth with Tony Shaffer. I have all the links up at the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com, so you can connect to Tony from there. I'm working on a great episode for Wednesday. It's going to show you how international relations really is extraordinarily complex and how we're focusing all of our attention in one area of the world, but we should be paying attention to other areas as well. So make sure that you tune in on Wednesday. As always, please share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. If you find the podcast informative, please give the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating and write a review on any podcasting platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.